Why did the room go quiet the moment she reached for the wrench? No one said anything at first. That was the part she noticed most. Radios still hissed. Distant impacts still echoed across the valley. But the human noise, the jokes, the arguments, the half-panicked orders, fell away when Captain Lena Ward stepped forward from the shadow of the maintenance truck. Her flight suit was dust-stained, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back so tight it pulled at her temples. The blue patch on her shoulder marked her as aviation support, not armor, not ground combat. Not the kind of officer anyone expected to see near a dead tank under fire. Someone muttered, "Pilot," like it was a diagnosis. The tank sat sideways across the supply route, engine alarms screaming uselessly, smoke curling from its rear like a warning no one wanted to read. Every convoy behind it was trapped. Every minute they waited tightened the noose. The crew inside hadn't moved in several minutes, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. Lena felt the weight of eyes on her back as she knelt beside the hull. She felt it her whole career, that quiet skepticism that followed her into rooms she hadn't been invited into. Too calm, too small, too technical. She learned early that competence didn't always announce itself loudly enough for people to notice. An officer barked at her to step back. This wasn't her problem. Air support was delayed. Recovery assets were hours out. They were preparing to abandon the vehicle. Lena didn't argue. She never did. She placed her palm against the armor instead, feeling vibration through the metal, heat, an uneven rhythm beneath the noise. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She was anxious, not afraid anxious. There was a difference. Fear scattered thoughts. Anxiety sharpened them. She leaned in closer, listening. There was something wrong they weren't seeing. Something subtle, something familiar. But she didn't say it yet. Not because she doubted herself, but because she knew timing mattered more than truth in moments like this. Another round landed closer. Dust shook loose from the vehicle. Someone swore loudly. Someone else laughed, brittle and sharp. Lena stood, wiped her hands on her trousers, and looked at the tank crew. Their faces were tight, eyes darting. She saw herself in them, trapped in a machine everyone assumed would protect them until it didn't. She raised her voice just enough. Kill power all systems. Oh, they hesitated. Then, surprisingly, they complied. And that's when the silence really began. Why did she know exactly where to place her hands without looking? Because this wasn't her first broken machine. Just the first one everyone was watching her fail or succeed on. Years ago, before the wings, before the rank, she'd been something else entirely. A ground tech, a fixer, the one called in when things failed in ways manuals didn't anticipate. She'd learned machines the way others learned people, by listening more than talking. She crouched low, ignoring shouted warnings about incoming fire. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. Each bolt checked twice. Each panel touched, not just seen. A young sergeant scoffed behind her. She's just maintenance. Lena didn't turn around. Ignored again. It stung more than she wanted to admit. But she kept working. She traced the damaged track assembly, eyes narrowing. The tank hadn't failed completely. It had compensated badly. A misalignment here, a feedback loop there. Small problems stacking until the system collapsed under its own corrections. Her pulse steadied as understanding clicked into place. She spoke softly now, technical language, precise, not for them, but for herself. A specialist nearby frowned, then leaned closer, then stopped laughing. There was something unsettling about how sure she sounded. A shell hit close enough to ring against the hull. Lena flinched, just once. Not from fear, but from frustration. They were running out of time. She climbed onto the tank without asking permission. Someone yelled. Someone cursed. Someone reached for her arm and stopped when she shook her head. Her heart hammered now, not from danger, but from responsibility. If she was wrong, people would die. If she was right, no one would remember who doubted her. She made the adjustment by feel alone, a fraction of a turn, then another. Sweat ran down her neck, darkening the collar of her suit. "Oh, power," she said. The engine coughed, died. A collective groan rose around her. Lena closed her eyes, listened, adjusted it again. Power. This time the engine caught, rough, uneven, alive. She didn't smile. Not yet. Why did she step into open ground when everyone else backed away? Because this part required eyes where armor couldn't protect them. She positioned herself behind the tank, fully exposed, tracking the movement of the tracks as they began to roll. Rounds struck nearby, kicking up dirt that peppered her boots. She felt small, breakable, and completely focused. "Slow," she called. "Hold, now ease left." The crew responded instantly. No hesitation now, no doubt. And trust had replaced rank. The tank lurched, then moved, inches at first, then feet. Lena's chest burned as she shouted corrections over the noise. Her voice stayed steady even as her hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing how thin the margin was. One wrong move, and the route would collapse entirely. Another impact knocked her to one knee. She swore under her breath, pushed herself back up, and kept going. Determined. The tank cleared the worst of the obstruction. The engine screamed, but it held. When she finally signaled stop, her legs felt weak beneath her. The route was open. No one cheered. They just stared. A senior officer arrived minutes later, eyes scanning the scene. His gaze locked on Lena, recognition flickering there. "Ward," he said quietly, "didn't know you were still fixing things the hard way." She straightened, nodded once. He didn't praise her. He didn't need to. "Good call," he said. That was enough. As the convoy rolled through, soldiers passed her without speaking. A few saluted, awkwardly, respectfully. Lena acknowledged them with a nod. then bent to retrieve her tools. Her hands were still shaking now, only now. Later, as dusk settled and the bass exhaled, she sat alone on a crate, helmet at her feet. The adrenaline drained away, leaving something heavier behind. She felt proud, and strangely empty. She wondered, not for the first time, how many moments like this passed unseen. How many women like her carried quiet victories no one would ever write down. A tank moved because she listened. People lived because she acted. And tomorrow, she would return to being just support. She didn't resent it anymore. Some strength wasn't meant to be loud. Some dignity didn't need witnesses. Sometimes resilience doesn't announce itself. It simply steps forward, listens carefully, and does the work when no one else can. And sometimes that's enough. Why did her hands hesitate this time, after the danger had already passed? The silence that followed the convoy's departure felt heavier than the shelling had. Lena noticed it as she packed her tools, each metallic click sounding too loud in the open air. Around her, the base returned to motion, guards rotating shifts, radios resuming routine chatter. But the moment itself hadn't ended. It lingered, hung in the spaces between glances and unfinished sentences. She could feel it on her skin, the awareness. A few soldiers watched her from a distance, curiosity replacing the dismissal they'd worn earlier. Not admiration, not yet. Something more uncomfortable. Recognition without context. Lena hated that part. She slung her bag over her shoulder and started toward the maintenance area, telling herself it was over. The tank was moving. The route was clear. People were alive. That should have been enough. But her chest felt tight. She told herself it was just the adrenaline wearing off. It usually was. After moments like that, her body always lagged behind her mind, replaying risks long after they'd passed. Still, there was something else underneath it. A familiar ache she rarely allowed herself to name. Being seen, finally. and not knowing what it would cost her. As she reached the edge of the bay, a voice stopped her. Calm, controlled. Captain Ward. She turned. The senior officer from earlier stood a few paces back, helmet tucked under his arm. His eyes were sharp, assessing without being invasive. He didn't smile. "Walk with me," he said, not a request, but not quite an order either. Lena nodded once and fell into step beside him. They walked in silence for several seconds, boots crunching on gravel. She waited. She always did. Let the other person decide what this conversation would be. You ever think about how many decisions get made because people don't want to look uncertain? He asked finally. The question surprised her. She glanced at him, then back ahead. All the time. He nodded, as if that answered something for him. You could have been wrong out there. Yes, sir. And you were. No, sir. He stopped walking and turned to face her. That confidence, where does it come from? There it was. Lena felt the old instinct rise, deflect, downplay. She had learned early that explaining herself rarely helped. It invited scrutiny, expectations, assumptions she couldn't control. But something in his expression wasn't accusatory. It was curious. I listen, she said finally. Machines talk. People just don't like to slow down enough to hear them. He studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. You ever think about teaching? Oh, the question hit harder than she expected. No, she said too quickly, then corrected herself. Not seriously. He didn't push. He just looked out toward the darkening horizon. We lose a lot of knowledge because the people who have it don't think it's theirs to pass on. Lena swallowed. She didn't trust her voice for a moment. They parted without ceremony. No orders, no promises. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted, even if neither of them knew what it meant yet. Later that night, alone in her quarters, Lena sat on the edge of her bunk, boots still on, staring at her hands. They were steady now, too steady. She flexed her fingers, remembering the moment they'd hovered over that final adjustment, the split second of doubt, not about the machine, but about herself. What if she was wrong? Not just out there, but in general. What if she had built her entire identity around being useful only when things were broken? The thought unsettled her more than incoming fire ever had. Sleep came late and shallow. Dreams flickered, metal grinding, alarms screaming, the feeling of standing exposed with nowhere to hide. She woke before dawn, heart racing, then lay there until the sky lightened, staring at the ceiling. By morning, routine reclaimed her. Briefings, checks, maintenance logs, the familiar comfort of systems and structure. She worked quietly, efficiently, avoiding conversation more than necessary. But the base was different now, and people noticed her. A young corporal asked her opinion on a generator issue. A sergeant deferred instead of dismissing. None of it was dramatic, just small shifts in posture and tone. Respect creeping in where indifference used to live. It should have felt good. Instead, it made her uneasy. She'd spent years perfecting the art of being underestimated. It gave her freedom, room to operate without interference, without expectation. Now, that invisibility was cracking. And cracks she knew could spread. The next mission came 2 days later. Not hers, not officially. A recon team needed a pilot familiar with low visibility insertion. Weather was unstable, terrain unforgiving, risk high. Lena was tagged as secondary support, backup only. She sat through the briefing at the edge of the table, listening more than speaking. The plan was solid on paper. It always was. But something bothered her. A detail that didn't fit. She waited. The lead pilot finished his overview, confident, articulate. Questions followed. Timelines adjusted. Then the room began to settle into that dangerous place where agreement replaced scrutiny. Lena felt her pulse pick up. Ignored, she reminded herself, it's fine. But the feeling wouldn't go away. She cleared her throat. Heads turned, some surprised, some annoyed. There's a thermal inversion expected near the ridge line, she said calmly. If it settles earlier than forecast, your visual references will flatten. You'll lose depth. The lead pilot frowned. We've accounted for that. On approach, she agreed, not on extraction. Silent. She could feel the weight of it again. The same weight from the road. The same moment of decision. Say more or let it go. Her jaw tightened. She hated this part. Hated pushing. Hated sounding like she needed to prove something. But people would be in the air, and she trusted machines more than optimism. It won't be catastrophic, she continued, but it'll be subtle, and subtle mistakes get people hurt. The room shifted. Someone asked a question. Another leaned forward. The lead pilot hesitated, then nodded slowly. They adjusted the plan. And afterward, he approached her privately. You should have been primary. The statement surprised her more than the original assignment. Maybe, she said, but you're ready. He studied her, then smiled faintly. You don't say much. No, she agreed. I say enough. The mission launched at dusk. Lena stood on the tarmac, watching the aircraft lift into the darkening sky, rotors cutting clean lines through the air. She felt the familiar mix of hope and unease. Trusting others with something you could do yourself was its own kind of vulnerability. And hours later, the team returned, tired, intact. The lead pilot caught her eye as he disembarked and gave a small nod. Relief washed through her, not dramatic, just deep. That night, as she walked back toward her quarters, Lena realized something had changed. Not around her, but inside. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was influencing outcomes. The thought scared her because influence came with responsibility, with visibility, with the risk of being wrong in ways that couldn't be quietly fixed. She paused outside her door, hand resting on the frame, and let herself feel it all. the pride, the doubt, the quiet fear of stepping into something larger than the role she'd built for herself. She had spent so long surviving in the margins that the center felt dangerous. But maybe growth always did. She went inside, closed the door, and sat in the dark for a moment before turning on the light. Tomorrow there would be more machines, more missions, more moments where someone had to decide whether to speak or stay silent. She didn't know yet which path she'd choose every time. But she knew this. Silence had its place, and so did her voice. Sometimes, strength wasn't about stepping forward under fire. Sometimes, it was about staying present when the world finally started listening. Why did the warning come from someone who hadn't slept in 30 hours? Lena heard the alarm before she understood it. Not the sharp, urgent kind that sent people running, but the low, insistent tone that crawled under the skin and refused to be ignored. She was halfway through a systems check when it sounded, hands deep in a panel she'd opened more times than she could count. For a moment, she stayed where she was, listening, counting the rhythm, letting instinct separate signal from noise. Across the hangar, heads lifted, conversations stalled. Someone swore quietly. Lena straightened and wiped her hands on her trousers. Fatigue tugged at her muscles now, the kind that didn't announce itself until it was already dangerous. She'd slept, technically, but rest was different. Rest required letting go. She wasn't good at that. A runner appeared at the entrance, breath quick, eyes wide. Briefing room, now. The room was already half full when she arrived. Maps lit the walls. A live feed flickered in one corner, grainy and unstable. The air felt tight, compressed by urgency and too many unfinished thoughts. She took a seat near the back. Old habit. Let the room reveal itself before stepping into it. An officer began speaking. Recon patrol, remote sector, communications intermittent, terrain worse than anticipated. One vehicle disabled, another pinned. Lena's stomach tightened. They rewound the footage, paused, zoomed. She leaned forward without realizing it. The disabled vehicle wasn't destroyed. It was quiet, too quiet, no smoke, no visible damage. That bothered her. They're assuming mechanical failure, someone said. Lena didn't look away from the screen or deliberate shutdown. A few heads turned. She felt the familiar heat rise behind her eyes. The moment before speaking always felt like standing on the edge of something thin and sharp. They cut power themselves, she continued. That pattern, see the way the antenna's angled. That's not damage, that's concealment. A silence settled. The officer frowned. Why would they? Because something's listening, Lena said softly. The feed glitched. Static bled across the screen. She felt it then, that low hum in her chest, the one that told her this wasn't about machines anymore. This was about timing and fear. Orders came quickly after that. A recovery team would move at first light, limited window, high risk, air support uncertain. Lena was listed as advisory only. Again, she didn't protest. She never did. But her jaw ached from how hard she clenched it. After the briefing, she stood alone in the corridor, staring at the floor, replaying the footage in her mind. Something wasn't right. The angles, the silence, the way the patrol hadn't called for help immediately. They were waiting. The senior officer from before approached, slowing as he reached her. You see something we don't. It wasn't a question. Lena nodded. They shut down to avoid detection. That means they expected someone or something to be hunting signals. He studied her. You think it's a trap? I think it's a test, she said. And they're the bait. He exhaled slowly. You're tired. Yes, sir. And still confident. Yes, sir. He hesitated. That flicker of uncertainty again, the same one she'd seen on the road. If you're right, then speed will get them killed, she finished. And silence might save them. The recovery team launched before dawn. Lena stood on the tarmac watching them lift off, the rotors beating a steady rhythm into the air. She felt the pull again, that urge to be there, to feel the vibration of the aircraft through her bones, to read the machine as it moved through hostile space. Instead, she stayed behind. Advisory only. Hours passed. The radio crackled intermittently. Fragmented updates. Static-heavy confirmations. No clear picture. Lena sat hunched over a console, tracking telemetry, watching for patterns others might miss. Her eyes burned. Her head throbbed. Then there it was. A deviation, small, almost elegant. She leaned closer. There drifting. A technician glanced at her, within tolerance. Not intentionally, Lena said. They're compensating for something they can't see. Her fingers flew over the controls, pulling up secondary data. Atmospheric, thermal, magnetic interference. Her heart sank. Someone's spoofing terrain data, she said, louder now. They're being guided into a dead zone. The room snapped to attention. Orders were shouted, channels opened, voices overlapped. Lena stood. They need to go dark, now full shutdown. That'll strand them, someone argued. They're already stranded, she shot back, surprising herself with the sharpness in her voice. At least this way they'll be alive. A pause. Then the order went through. The feed went black. Minutes stretched into something unbearable. Lena felt every second like a weight pressing into her spine. She paced once, then stopped, forced herself to be still. Panic didn't help. It never had. She thought about the patrol, cold, still, listening, waiting. Finally, movement. A faint signal, manual, weak. They were moving on foot. Relief hit her so hard her knees nearly buckled. They made it out hours later, exhausted, shaken, alive. The room exhaled. Someone clapped her on the shoulder. Good call. She nodded, but the praise slid off her like rain. Her hands were shaking again. Later, alone, she sat on the floor of her quarters, back against the wall, helmet resting beside her. She felt broken, not dramatically, just worn thin. She thought about how close it had been, how easily her voice could have been ignored, how many times before it had been. She pressed her palms into her eyes and breathed. She didn't want to be brave. She wanted to be right. Because being right meant people lived. The next morning, she was summoned again. A different room, smaller, fewer people. The senior officer gestured for her to sit. "We're forming a task cell," he said. "Cross-functional, quiet." Lena's pulse quickened. "Sir, we need people who notice what others miss," he continued. "People who don't need to be loud to be effective." He looked at her directly. "We need you." The weight of it settled over her slowly. Not pride. Responsibility. She nodded once. "Yes, sir." As she left the room, she felt the familiar conflict rise again. Determined but anxious. Ready but unsure. She was stepping out of the margins now, into a place where silence wasn't always an option. And for the first time she wondered, not without fear, what it would mean to be fully seen. Sometimes growth doesn't come with certainty. Sometimes it comes with a quiet decision to stay when it would be easier to step back. And sometimes strength isn't proven under fire, but in the moments when you choose not to disappear. Why did she feel more exposed in a quiet room than she ever had under fire? Lena noticed it the moment the door closed behind her. No alarms, no radios, no dust in the air. Just a table, a screen, and 6 people who had already decided she mattered. That realization settled on her shoulders heavier than any body armor ever had. The task cell didn't look special. No flags, no dramatic titles. Just a map with too many layers and faces that didn't waste time pretending this was ordinary work. Intelligence, logistics, aviation, cyber, ground operations. People who lived between rules rather than inside them. She took the seat offered to her and folded her hands to keep them still. The briefing began without ceremony, a pattern of disruptions, disabled vehicles, silent patrols, systems failing in ways that didn't quite make sense, not dramatic enough to make headlines, not obvious enough to trigger full responses. Lena leaned forward as the data scrolled. It wasn't random. She felt it in the way a mechanic felt imbalance before vibration turned violent. Someone was studying them, not attacking directly, probing, watching how they reacted, how quickly they adapted, which failures they tolerated. This isn't about destroying assets, Lena said quietly before she realized she'd spoken. Heads turned, but no one interrupted her. It's about shaping behavior, she continued. They want us predictable. They want us tired. The intelligence officer nodded slowly. We were thinking the same. That word, we, hit her harder than she expected. For the first time, she wasn't an outlier. She was part of the shape forming in the room. Assignments were given, not orders, responsibilities. Lena's role was simple on paper: systems analysis, field validation, advisory on anything that didn't feel right. In reality, it meant she would be everywhere and nowhere, listening, watching, saying something only when it mattered. She could do that. She was good at that. Still, as the meeting ended and people filed out, she remained seated for a moment, staring at the map. Lines crossed and recrossed like unresolved thoughts. This wasn't a single broken machine. It was a system under stress. And systems didn't fail all at once. They failed quietly, then suddenly. The first deployment with the task cell came sooner than she expected. Forward position, minimal footprint, limited support. The kind of place that existed more on maps than in memory. Lena arrived by air, boots hitting unfamiliar ground as the rotors faded into the distance. The quiet was unsettling. No obvious damage, no visible threat, just a sense of something waiting. She moved through the site methodically, checking equipment, talking to personnel, asking questions that sounded casual but weren't. How often systems rebooted, when alerts first appeared, what they'd tried before calling it in. Most answers were vague shrugs, just one of those things. She hated that phrase. Machines didn't do just one of those things. At dusk, she stood alone near a generator, hand resting against its casing. The vibration was wrong, not enough to alarm anyone else, enough to bother her. She shut it down without asking. A lieutenant protested. Power was stable. They needed uptime. Not like this, Lena said calmly. Not tonight. He hesitated, then stepped back. When they restarted it 30 minutes later, the fault revealed itself. An intermittent feedback issue that would have cascaded under load. You saved us a blackout, someone muttered. Lena nodded, but her chest felt tight. Because it wasn't about the generator. It was about how close they were to missing it. That night she lay awake on a narrow cot, listening to the unfamiliar rhythm of the outpost. Wind against canvas, distant movement, the low hum of systems trying to behave. She thought about how many times she'd been ignored before something broke badly enough to demand attention. She wondered how many people didn't get a second chance. By the third day, the pattern sharpened. Minor failures clustered around moments of transition, shift changes, weather shifts, communication handoffs, stress points. They're not attacking us, Lena told the cell over a secure channel. They're leaning on us, waiting for us to lean back wrong. Silence followed. Then, what do you recommend? She closed her eyes briefly. Slow down, she said. We've been trained to respond fast. That's what they're counting on. We need to create uncertainty. How? By not fixing everything immediately, she replied. Let some systems fail safely. Change routines. Break their model of us. It went against instinct. against doctrine, against the comfort of control. But they listened. The next incident came 2 days later. A convoy rerouted unexpectedly. Communications glitched. Confusion spiked. But this time, no one panicked. They paused, assessed, adapted. The failure didn't cascade. Lena felt a strange mix of pride and fear. This was working. And if it was working, it meant the opposition would notice. That night, she received a message on a secure line. No identification, just coordinates and a time stamp. Her stomach tightened. She brought it to the cell immediately. No drama, no assumptions. This is either a trap, someone said, or a leak, or a test. Lena replied quietly. They prepared accordingly. The location was remote, sparse, quiet in a way that felt intentional. Lena moved with the team, senses stretched thin, every sound registering. They found the equipment cache exactly where the message indicated. Damaged, disabled, familiar sabotage patterns. But something was different. This isn't hostile, Lena said, kneeling beside the wreckage. It's instructional. She traced the damage. Clean, precise, almost respectful. They're showing us what they can do, she continued, and what they chose not to do. The realization chilled her. This wasn't war as she'd known it. This was conversation. On the flight back, Lena stared out the window at the dark terrain sliding past below. Her reflection stared back at her, eyes tired, mind racing. She felt broken in a new way, not from exhaustion, but from awareness. The world was more fragile than she'd believed, and she was now part of the thin line holding it together. Back at base, she stood alone on the tarmac long after the aircraft departed. The night air was cool, still. She thought about the road, the tank, the moment she'd stepped into open fire because no one else could see what she saw. This felt the same, just quieter. She wasn't fixing machines anymore. She was fixing blind spots. And that responsibility didn't come with a wrench. It came with doubt, with second guessing, with nights where sleep refused to come. She welcomed none of it, but she accepted all of it. Because some roles don't choose you loudly, they settle on you gradually. And by the time you notice the weight, it's already yours to carry. Sometimes resilience isn't about enduring impact. Sometimes it's about staying alert in the calm, knowing that silence, too, can be a warning. Why did the smallest decision suddenly feel like the most dangerous one she'd ever make? Lena realized it at dawn, standing alone at the edge of the airstrip, watching heat shimmer rise from the ground. Nothing was happening. That was the problem. No alarms, no warnings, no obvious threat. Just a quiet that felt curated, like a room arranged to look untouched after someone had already been through it. She rubbed her eyes and forced herself to focus. Fatigue blurred judgment. She knew that. Everyone in the task cell knew it. They rotated shifts, tracked sleep, monitored stress indicators. On paper, they were managing it. In reality, the work never left her. She had started seeing patterns even when she closed her eyes. Lines connecting events that no one else thought belonged together. Minor malfunctions, delayed responses, people saying, "That's odd," and moving on. Lena couldn't move on because odd was where systems began to fail. The message came in mid-morning, clean, encrypted, routed through channels that technically shouldn't have existed. No threats, no demands, just a question. How long do you intend to keep reacting? Lena stared at the screen, pulse steady, stomach tight. Around her, the task cell leaned in, tension rising but controlled. This wasn't a surprise, not really. She'd known the conversation would escalate. They want engagement, someone said. They want control, another countered. Lena stayed quiet, reading the message again. Not the words, the tone. It wasn't taunting. It wasn't rushed. It was patient. They're inviting us to respond. she said finally, but not the way we think. The senior officer watched her closely, meaning, they don't want a reply, Lena said. They want a behavior. Silence followed. They've been shaping us by observing what we fix, how fast we fix it, and what we ignore, she continued. Now they're checking whether we'll do the same to them. Someone scoffed softly. You're suggesting we ignore this. I'm suggesting we choose what kind of silence we give them, Lena replied. The room shifted. This wasn't doctrine. This wasn't safe. The officer folded his arms. And if you're wrong, Lena met his gaze. Her voice was calm, but inside everything tightened. Then we'll lose initiative, she said. But if we respond the way they expect, we'll lose it anyway. This was the moment she'd been dreading. Not the decision itself, but the ownership of it. For years, she'd operated in the margins, advising, fixing, quietly correcting course without being the one at the helm. Now the room was waiting on her judgment. That scene, she hated that word. She took a slow breath. Give me 48 hours, she said. No response, no visible reaction. We change nothing publicly, but we harden everything quietly. And if they escalate, someone asked. They already have, Lena replied. This just tells us whether they're bluffing or listening. The call was made. The silence that followed was deliberate. No counter message, no troop movement, no visible tightening of posture. Outwardly, operations continued as normal. Internally, everything changed. Lena worked non-stop, cross-checking redundancies, introducing micro-variations into routines, small enough not to draw attention, significant enough to disrupt pattern modeling. She slept in fragments, ate without noticing. Her body moved on muscle memory and discipline alone. And anxiety crept in during the quiet moments. Not fear. Fear was loud. Anxiety was subtle. It whispered questions she couldn't fully answer. What if she'd misread the tone? What if patience wasn't restraint, but preparation? On the second night, she sat alone in the task cell room, lights dimmed, screens glowing softly. The bass hummed around her, unaware of the invisible tension stretching outward into the dark. She thought about the tank again, about stepping into fire because waiting felt worse. This felt worse than that, because fire was honest. This was. At 300, a system flagged an anomaly, not an attack, a withdrawal. Multiple hostile observation nodes gone, dark, abandoned almost simultaneously. Lena's heart kicked hard against her ribs. They're disengaging. Someone said, disbelief in their voice. No, Lena replied quietly. They're acknowledging. She leaned closer to the screen. The timing was too clean, too intentional. They wanted to know if we'd flinch, she said. We didn't. Relief rippled through the room, but it didn't reach her. Because she knew this wasn't a victory. It was a calibration. By morning, command wanted answers, reports, metrics, clear outcomes. Lena stood in another quiet room, once again feeling exposed in a way that had nothing to do with danger. She explained carefully, without drama, without claiming certainty she didn't have. Some nodded, some frowned. One general asked, "Are you saying restraint was the objective?" "I'm saying restraint was the test," Lena answered, "and we passed." The general studied her. That's not how wars are usually won. No, sir, she said evenly, but it's how they're avoided. The room went still. Afterward, alone again, Lena finally felt it, the delayed impact. Her hands trembled. Her knees felt weak. The cost of carrying responsibility without armor. She sat down hard in an empty corridor and pressed her palms into the floor, grounding herself in the cold. Broken, not in a way anyone could see, but in the quiet realization that there was no going back to being invisible. Once people trusted your judgment, they expected you to keep being right. She didn't know if she could. Later that day, she received a message, not encrypted this time, handwritten, slipped under her door. No signature. You listened. That was all. Her breath caught, not from fear, but from the weight of recognition. She burned the note immediately. That night, she stood on the roof of the operations building, staring out at the lights scattered across the base. Each one represented people who trusted systems they didn't fully understand. People who slept because someone else stayed awake. Lena rested her elbows on the railing and let the exhaustion wash over her. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt tired, humbled, quietly proud. She thought about all the times she'd been dismissed, all the moments she doubted herself because others did first. And she realized something that unsettled her even more than the day's events. She had stopped asking for permission, not out of arrogance, out of necessity. The next morning, she woke before the alarm, clarity settling in her chest like a decision already made. She would keep listening, keep slowing things down when speed felt reckless, keep choosing restraint even when action would earn more praise. Because the work wasn't about being seen. It was about preventing the moments when someone else would have to step into fire. And if that meant carrying doubt alone, she could live with that. Sometimes leadership doesn't look like command. Sometimes it looks like the quiet courage to wait and trust that restraint, chosen deliberately, can be its own form of strength. Why did it feel heavier to finish than it ever had to begin? Lena sensed the ending before anyone named it. The tempo had changed, not slowed, settled. Systems were holding. Patterns had loosened their grip. The quiet no longer felt staged. It felt earned. That was how she knew the task cell's work was nearing a pause, if not an end. She stood alone at the edge of the flight line at dusk, watching a transport lift into the dark. The wind carried the familiar smells: fuel, dust, metal cooling after a long day. She felt older than she had weeks ago, not worn out, tempered. People passed her now and nodded. Some smiled. A few stopped to ask questions they once wouldn't have thought to bring to her. She answered when it mattered, redirected when it didn't. The role had changed her posture more than her voice. She took up space differently now, not larger, just steadier. That steadiness came at a cost. The task cell gathered one last time in the small room without ceremony. No flags, no speeches, just faces that had learned how to listen to one another. The senior officer outlined the transition, responsibilities returning to standard channels, monitoring handed off, rotations scheduled. The words were procedural, but the meaning was not. They were letting go. Lena felt a flicker of relief, and then the ache beneath it. When something intense ends, it leaves behind a hollow that routine can't immediately fill. She knew that hollow well. It was where doubt liked to live. You changed how we operate, the officer said, not looking at her directly. That doesn't disappear. She nodded once. She didn't trust herself to say more. After the meeting, she lingered, helping stack chairs that didn't need stacking, straightening cables already straight. One by one, the room emptied. When she was alone, she sat and stared at the blank wall where maps had once lived. For the first time in weeks, there was nothing she needed to fix. The realization frightened her. She walked back to her quarters slowly, letting the night air cool the day from her skin. Halfway there, she stopped. The habit of vigilance tugged at her. Listen, check, anticipate. She forced herself to pause and do none of it. Just stand. Her chest tightened, then eased. She breathed in deeply, counting. She hadn't realized how shallow her breaths had been until they were. Inside, she packed quietly. Not everything, just enough. She'd be reassigned soon. A new role, a new place. They asked her preference. She hadn't given one. She sat on the edge of the bed and finally let the fatigue land. Not collapse. Land. The kind that comes when you allow yourself to feel what you've been holding back. She felt proud, of the work, of the people, of herself in a cautious way that didn't tempt fate. She also felt broken, not damaged, but altered. The way metal changes after heat, stronger in some ways, less forgiving in others. She wondered who she'd been before the tank on the road, before the quiet rooms, before people started waiting on her judgment. That version of herself felt distant now, not gone, just integrated into something larger. In the morning, she was called in early, not for an emergency, for closure. The general sat across from her, hands folded, eyes sharp but not unkind. "You won't like this," he said. She almost smiled. "I rarely do, sir." "We're recommending you for a standing advisory role," he continued. "Across commands, quiet, no spotlight." Her pulse jumped, then steadied. "And if I say no?" "You won't," he said gently. "Not because you can't, but because you know what happens when no one listens." He wasn't wrong. She'd seen that road. She nodded once. "I'll do it." As she stood to leave, he added, "You never asked for credit." "No, sir." "Good," he said. "That's why this worked." Outside, the day unfolded in ordinary ways. Vehicles moved, radios crackled, people laughed near the mess hall. Life went on. That, she realized, was the point. She found herself back near the maintenance bay without meaning to. The same place where she'd started, hands oily, unseen. She watched a young mechanic work through a stubborn issue, frustration tight in his shoulders. Lena approached quietly, stood beside him, listened. "Try it now," she said after a moment. He did. The engine smoothed. He looked at her, surprised. "How did you?" "I listened," she replied. He nodded, thoughtful, and went back to work. She walked away before the gratitude could turn into a story. That evening, as the sun slipped low and the base softened into shadow, Lena climbed the short ladder to the roof one last time. She rested her forearms on the railing and watched the horizon. She thought about the people she'd never meet who would sleep easier because of small decisions made quietly about the missions that would never happen because restraint had interrupted momentum, about the machines that would keep moving because someone noticed a subtle change and chose to act without applause. She felt hopeful, not naive, not bright, grounded. A hope she'd learned wasn't loud. It was the confidence that systems could be made gentler if people paid attention. Her radio chirped, a routine check-in. She answered, voice calm, and closed the channel. The night settled fully. Stars emerged, faint but steady. Lena stood there until the air cooled and the sounds of the bass shifted into their nighttime rhythm. Then she turned, descended the ladder, and blended back into the flow of people and purpose. She didn't need the moment to mark her. She knew what she'd done, and she knew what she would keep doing. Because sometimes strength isn't the force that breaks through noise. Sometimes it's the patience to hear what's almost missed. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.